Churchill, and Johnson stuck to the traditional poetic ethos. However, there were very few poets who broke away completely from the old traditional influences, and most of them were looking the both ways, that is, the neoclassical past and the romantic future simultaneously. Simultaneously, you understand, means at one time. Okay, they started looking both ways, the neoclassical poet past also and the romantic future also. That is why we can say that they seem to placid on the isthmus of a middle state, and that is the condition of transition. That when we are not able to uh, when we are not able to forget the past, but we also start accepting the present. So now poets wanted to express emotion again. Why this again word has been used by me? Because in the Elizabethan age, that is before neoclassical poetry, most of the poems which were written during that time was giving importance to emotion. But during neoclassical age, that was the age of prose and reason, logic. So they have age. Some new poets have come and they have started expressing emotions. So poets wanted to express emotions again. They wanted to leave the city far behind and travel back to the simple countryside where rustic, humble men, women resided, and they started using that subject. Okay, there were very few 18th century poets who showed some elements of romanticism while not completely ignored the old conventions. These poets were caught in the middle of neoclassical writing and the Romantic age, and therefore they are known as transitional poets. So, when we say that rustic and humble men and women resided, means if you remember, then the two poems written by Wordsworth, that is Daffodils and the Solitary Reaper, when we remember that poems, we automatically think that what was the transition towards? What the poet of neoclassical poetry they wanted during that time, they wanted to be. They wanted to go in the simple countryside, and where there should be the rustic elements, the humble men and women, the common people. So, common man has now come to the center. Okay, common man has now become the subject of the poetry that has happened in transitional phase, but it has not become yet complete, but it is a transitional phase. It is going to come in romantic poetry. When you will read romantic poetry, then you will find that most of the poems which were written at that time were keeping common man in mind and the problems associated with the common man. Okay, his thinking towards supernatural elements, towards mysticism, towards intuition. All these things we find when romantic age has come completely. But now we are here to talk about the transition phase. So, the most important traditional poets were William Blake, Robert Burns, George Crabbe, William Cooper, William Collins, Thomas Gray, James Thompson, and Oliver Goldsmith. The second half of the 18th century is known as transitional period. It was an era of change from pseudo classicism to romanticism. Now, why it is known as pseudo? Pseudo means literally means false. So, why false classicism? Because they copied the classical elements, they copied the classical writers, but they were not copying the content also, only the style they adopted. Therefore, they are known as pseudo classicism, pseudo classicist. Now, in second half of the 18th century, what happened? There was a change of era from pseudo classicism to romanticism. So, the decline of the party spirit and the democratic upsurge exercised great influence both on life and literature. Means during that time, the Whig party and the other party was there, Tory. The party politics has gone, and now people was having a democratic upsurge, and this has given a great influence not only the literature on not only on the life of the people but also on the literature. So first we'll try to know that what all are the main characteristics of transition poetry or transitional poets. So first of all, there was a decline of party feud. So, as I have just told you, that the rivalry between the Whigs and the Tories were very much in 18th century, and the neoclassical poets they have written more and more about them. Now, what happened when there was an upsurge of romanticism? Then the rivalry between these two parties continued, but it's lost its bitterness. The bitterness was not there. You can say that neck to neck fight was not there. This naturally led to a considerable decline of the activity in political pamphleteering. Okay, why? Because in 18th century, if pamphlet writing was very popular because of this party division, and people, some of them supported Whig party, some of them supported Tory party, and there were so many pamphlets written. But now the bitterness has gone. So what has happened? The poets have there is a decline in the activity of political pamphleteering. The poets and the satirists during that time ceased to be statesmen. The institution of literary patronage gradually crumbled during this period, and men of letters learned to depend entirely to their public, on their public. Okay, so there was a decline in the party feud. The main characteristics of this period was, the another characteristic was influence of French Revolution. What happened during the second half of the 18th century? New ideas were germinating and new forces were gathering. The uh, and at that time, there was a French Revolution of 1789, and that French Revolution, you can say, was a climax of a long and deeply diffused unrest. Whatever people started germinating the new ideas, and people started accepting emotions, intuitions. So all of this was what was the climax of it? The French Revolution of 1789 was the climax of it. Why? Because revolutionary ideas gave birth to democratic and humanitarian feelings, and it these two feelings has influenced the literature a lot. The another point which we need to note here is the revival of learning. So this period is characterized by a kind of mild revival of learning. In literature, it revealed itself in the study and editing of old authors like Chaucer, Shakespeare, and Milton. Okay, the writers they revived the old form of ballad. The publication of Bishop Percy's relics, containing the oldest and the finest specimen of ballad literature, is a landmark in the history of Romantic movement. So there was a revival of learning. People at that time, they whosoever were associated with literature, they once again started reading Chaucer, Shakespeare, and Milton. As the classicists, neoclassicists, they started reading the classical writers, the romantic writers or the precursors of the romantic writers. They have started reading Chaucer, Shakespeare, and Milton. And among this, the Bishop Percy's Relics, which was published in 1765, was a landmark in the Romantic poet movement. The latter of the half of the 18th century witnessed the swift rise of historical literature. Now, The next point is there was a new realism. Now, what was the new realism? The new realism was that the birth of a new spirit of inquiry was at the root of realism. Means that people started knowing that from where the problem comes, which is the core of the problem. And this has given to the new realism revival, or you can say birth of new realism. Okay, that is why in this age you will see in the novels of the period and in the further writings of this period, you will find that the new realism is being expressed. Next point of this age is the humanitarian spirit. So, this period is characterized by the rapid growth of democracy. Stress was led both, the individual on the man, as I said you, that the common man, stress was led on them. People became familiar with the notions of equality, liberty, and brotherhood. These all qualities or these all things were not discussed in neoclassical literature. So now people have become aware of equality, liberty, and brotherhood. The philosophy of Rousseau and the French Revolution has popularized these democratic and humanitarian ideals. And because Rousseau and the the writings of Rousseau and the French Revolution was so much is left an imprint on the mind of the people that it has immensely influenced the literature of that time. Though the Augustines, they believed that the proper study of mankind is to know man, but still they were far indifferent to the beauties of nature. And Rousseau is writing, and the French Revolution has given, you can say, has ignited the humanitarian spirit and the democratic feelings or ideals during that time. Now, next, we will come to know about the transitional poets. Who were the transitional poets? So, as I have told you, that the transitional poetry marks the beginning of a reaction against the rational, intellectual, formal, artificial, and unromantic poetry of Pope, Johnson, Dryden. Why they were unromantic? Because they were very rational, because they were very intellectual, because they were very formal. Okay, when we talk of emotions, then some informality is done. Okay, then some biasness actually comes. So purely intellectuality can't be there, and that is why these poets of neoclassical era, they were not at all giving expression to emotion, and that is why their poetry is known as rational, formal, intellectual, and unromantic. Okay, now the word romantic has nothing to do with the romance of a boy or a girl here. Actually, romantic means that how deeply you understand the feelings of others, how deeply you understand the growth of the nature, the laughing flowers, the moving wind, how intensively you feel that. And if the feeling is very intensive, then you can very well express it. That's what the romantics believed, and it started with the transitional poets. So it was marked by a strong reaction against the stereotyped rules, whatever the rules they have set, the neoclassicists. It was a reaction. Okay, and the transitional poets, they derived their inspiration from which poems or which poets? From Spenser, Shakespeare, and Milton. Unlike the Augustan poetry, transitional poets used to describe about the countryside of common and ordinary people, not of fashionable or aristocratic society or town life, as we find most of these description in neoclassical poetry. So, love for nature and human life now became the characteristics of poetry. So, the transitional poets, they revolted against the conventional poetic style and the diction of the Augustan poetry. They aimed at achieving simplicity of expression. This poetry appealed to emotions and imagination. So it is, you can say, they mark the beginning of naturalism. And when we talk of naturalism, we have two, three names which is very prominent, and that is Crabbe, Blake, and Burns. That is Robert Burns, George Crabbe, and William Blake. They were the pioneers of naturalism. So that you can say that the transitional poets were the forerunners of a splendid outburst of romantic poetry of the 19th century. So who were the forerunners? The transitional poets. Now next we'll describe the characteristics of transitional poetry. Transitional poets, they were tired of neoclassical ideals of reason and wit. Reason and wit cannot be the thing upon which only the poetry can be written. There can be the other aspects of poetry, and that's what the transitional poets believed. They tried to find another characteristic. They tried to find a midway. They dropped the conventional poetic diction and forms in favor of free forms and bolder language, where they did not follow a pattern. As the neoclassical poets, they used to follow a pattern. The transitional poets, they dropped that. They stopped following the conventional patterns. They have adopted a free language and a bold statement. They preach the return to nature. They return to nature. Again, I told you why it was return to nature, because the earlier poets, for example, Chaucer or Shakespeare or Spencer, they were the poets who write too much about nature. But during this time, means even the metaphysicals, they have written so much about nature, and they have expressed them. They were the best examples of rather intellect and emotion. Okay, no poetry. I mean, the history of English literature, metaphysicals were entirely different because they had the grip on emotion as well as reason. Anyways, we are not supposed to discuss metaphysical here. So, what I am telling is that they had a return to nature. Return to nature means they started following the Elizabethan traits of writing poetry. Elizabethan poetry, it has become a revival of that. Now, what is there is that the bookish knowledge or the bookish nature of artificial pastoral or affectation, you can say, these all things were removed. Rather, the natural thing, the affection. There is a difference between affectation and affection. Affection means when you have a real involvement. Affectation means when you have an artificial behavior. So the poets returned to real nature, and they started avoiding the bookish nature and the artificial pastoral. There was a fresh interest in the man of the world and the nature. So, the era of transition was that of varied experience. It was an era of innovation, and the poets of that time, they believed firmly in the individual poetic inspiration. Individual poetic inspiration means the common man, what the common man is thinking, what can he think, or through what mental agony he travels. All these things were given importance. What is the intuition? So the next characteristic is that passion, emotion, and imagination, this was valued by the transitional poets. They saw new appreciation of nature and you can say that their poetry was not a drawing room poetry. As I have told you, reading Pope will make you feel that the poetry is of a drawing room poetry, but reading Wordsworth will have no such feelings. Their poetry also became more subjective, as in neoclassical poetry, we have objective type of poetry. As I told you, this was a non-judgmental thing, but now there was a judgmental thing. Okay, their poetry became subjective. There was also a strong revolt against that heroic couplet, because the poets of neoclassical era, they made it a mandatory for everyone to follow the heroic couplet. But now in transitional era, poets who were there belonging to that time, they never wanted that there should be only one pattern of writing poetry. Rather, they believed that the poems can be written in a freer way, in a blank verse, in a the way the emotion comes, that needs to be expressed. It is not that we should go by certain rules, regulations, or we should follow certain things. So, and then next thing was, there was a much interest in the Middle Ages, as I have told you, that the age of Chaucer and Pope, age of Chaucer and Shakespeare, much interest was there, and Dryden and Pope were neglected. So these are the characteristics which we can say of transitional poets. Now we can talk of some transitional poets who were very important, and their work have led a remarkable, you can say, the pathway to the romanticism. And the first name which comes under this is James Thompson. He was from 1700 to 1748. He was the first person to bring a new note in poetry, both in both the poems. Whatever he has written, the poems are Seasons and the Castle of Indolence. Now, the Seasons is a blank verse poem, and it consists of the long series of descriptive passages dealing with natural scenes. Though its style is clumsy, the treatment is refreshing, and it is full of acute observations and acute joy in nature. There, he has written poetry of a cycle of four long poems he has discussed in blank verse, with a brief concluding hymn. So, hymn, that is HYMN. Hymn is what? It is a religious ideas. Okay. The season celebrates the magnificence and harmony of nature as a manifestation of the Supreme Being. Supreme Being means God. It embodies literary, philosophical, and theological ideas which were the characteristics of the 18th century, yet it did not find any written form during that time. Thompson has taken an initiative to give the philosophical and theological concept of writing in poetry form. And the poem also prefigures the Romantic movement of the 19th century, particularly in its description of storms and wilderness. Now, romantics or romantic poets, they have, along with the emotions, they have also described the other part of the emotion, that is wildness. And all these wildness and storms and intuition, supernatural being, all these are being described by James Thompson in The Seasons. So this poem, it enjoyed extraordinary popularity, and it influenced in both centuries because of its impressive, picturesque landscape, and it made a favorite text of illustration. The next poetry, which was written by James Thompson, was The Castle of Indolence. It was written in Spenserian stanza. And I have told you that these poets, they tried to follow the poems of Middle Ages. Therefore, he has adopted this style also. And the Castle of Indolence, it is written in Spenserian stanza, and it is remarkable for its dreamy melancholy. What is melancholy? Melancholy is when you are very sad, okay, but at the same time you give expression to your emotions. So, this poem, The Castle of Indolence, it is remarkable for its dreamy melancholy, harmonious versification, and suggestiveness. We can quote here also, according to the Encyclopedia, the Castle of Indolence is a place in which the dwellers live amid luxurious delights to the innervation of soul and body. Okay, so the poem is written in Spenserian stanza at a time when they were outdated. They were considered outdated. So because it has revived that form of writing, so it people remember this poem because of this only. And this poem has given a great influence on the romantic poets such as Lord Byron, William Wordsworth, and John Keats. The another poet which we are going to talk about is Oliver Goldsmith. Oliver Goldsmith, basically, he is known for She Stoops to Conquer and the Vicar of Wakefield. But as a poet also, he was very popular as a transitional poet because though he sometimes write in heroic couplets, but the message which he wants to give through his poetry is much familiar with the romantic thinking or romantic ideas. So from 1728 to 1774, he represents the poetic tradition of neoclassicism as far as heroic couplet is concerned. But his treatment of nature and rural life and a note of human sympathy and simplicity of expression makes him come into the category of transitional poet. His first poem, The Traveller, it is written in heroic couplet and deals with his wanderings through Europe. He uses a simple and polished language, and he reveals human sympathy for the sufferings of the poor. And that is why I told you that he has been put into the category of transitional poets. The whole title of the poem is The Traveller or a Prospect of Society. It was written in 1764, and it is a philosophical poem, you can say, by Goldsmith. Though written in heroic couplet, it discusses the cause of happiness and unhappiness in nation. So it was the work which first made Goldsmith's name and is still considered a classic of mid 18th century poetry. Now, the next poem, which we'll be talking about, written by Oliver Goldsmith, is The Deserted Village. The Deserted Village describes the memories of his youth. It was published in 1770, and it is a work of social commentary that condemns rural depopulation and pursuit of excessive wealth. So there again, he has described about the things which leads to the downfall of human being. That is, he condemns about the rural depopulation as well as the pursuit of excessive wealth. Again, this poem is written in heroic couplet that makes him belong to the category of neoclassical. But when we come to the content of the poetry, when we come to the emotions expressed in the poetry, then we can think that, okay, this poetry again can come in transitional groups because it describes the decline of a village and the emigration of many of its residents to America. In the poem, Goldsmith criticizes rural depopulation, the moral corruption found in the towns, consumerism, landscape gardening, avarice, and the pursuit of wealth from international trade. So, all these are described in this poem. One critic is saying The poem employs deliberately precise obscurity and does not reveal the reason why the village has been deserted. Still, I mean, this is a critical version. So, critical version can be anything. People can love it also, people can reject it also. But that doesn't mean that there was no romantic elements into this poetry. The poem was very popular in 18th and 19th century, and it provoked the critical responses. Even it got the response from George Crabbe, who was another transitional poet, and he has described this poem. He has given the reference to this poem, particularly in the poem where he has written, "I fares the land." Okay, so there he has taken the reference of it. The next name, which is going to be very popular in transitional poets, is Thomas Gray, 16 to 1771. He was the epitome of the change which were coming over the literature of his age. And when we take the name of Thomas Gray, we remember that poem, The Elegy Written in a Country Churchyard. So that was his, you can say, milestone work. So he was a born poet, and but he fell in the age of a prose, you can say. Still, through his writing, he has shown that he had that uh, feelings, and he could understand the human deep inside. So his early poems were hymn to adversity and the odes to spring and on a distant prospect of Eton College. These all poems has a note of melancholy, and that characterizes the entire poetry of that period. He is popularly known as, or you can say, a landmark, the elegy written in a country churchyard. Why this poem is a landmark? Because it has many new features in it. It is remarkable for the minute observation in the descriptions of nature, love, and sympathy, for the humble and deprived expressions of the primary emotions of human life. Elegy written in a country churchyard. The British writer, I mean, the poem's speaker calmly, he means Thomas Gray calmly mulls over the death while standing in a rural graveyard in the evening. He's taking stock of the graves, and he reflects that death comes for everyone in the end, and notes that the elaborate tombs of the rich won't bring their occupants back from the dead. Means it is a very, you can say, a very die-hard truth that we all are going to die. And it's not that I'm very rich or someone is very poor, then the at cemetery, or when we will be graved in our graveyard, these things will give any importance to us. No, everyone will be dying and everyone will be cremated in the same way. There is no difference that will be made because of the richness or the poor. He also commemorates the common folk buried in the churchyard by imagining the lives they might have lived, and they have been born into better circumstances than they have taken the benefits of anonymity. The poem ends with his own imagined epitaph. His two odes, The Progress of Poesy and The Bard, express the new conception of the poet as an inspired singer. Even his poetry has also shown Milton's influence regarding melody and variety of experience, and the bard is even more romantic and original. So this was about Thomas Gray. The next poet whom we are going to discuss is William Collins. Now, William Collins, 1721 to 1759, he wrote his first final work, Oriental Eclogues, in prevailing mechanical couplets. Means in couplets only it was written, but it was romantic in spirit, and The feelings were much expressed there. Now, his Ode to the Evening is one of the finest poems written by him, and also uh, it is a collection, rather. He has written odes on several descriptive and allegorical subjects, in which Ode to the Evening is also one of the finest poems from that collection, because it is composed in a single stanza of 52 lines with unrhyming pattern. There is an unrhyming pattern, but the poem is addressed to the evening, who is regarded as the goddess, nymph, or the maid. And the personified evening is chaste, revered, and meek, opposite to the characteristics of the bright sun. Understood? So, this poem has three main parts, you can say. The first one is the opening salutation to the evening. The second one is the center, where the poet requests for guidance in receiving peace. And the last one is his personal point of view to return to the general aspect. He has also written Ode to Popular Superstitions of the Highlands, and this poem has introduced a new world of witches, fairies, and medieval kings. So we find again supernatural elements in Samuel Taylor Coleridge. So it strikes from here only, you can say, it strikes a new beginning and interesting note in romantic revival. Now, he also adopted the iambic pentameter ending with an alexandrine, means the same thing which was done earlier. Collins' themes were significant because they anticipate the interests of the early 19th century Romantic poets, and thus the broad concerns found in modern poetry also. The five themes that were very noteworthy in Collins were his role of imagination in poetry. He believed that imagination rather than reason is the essential trait of the poet. Second, he is a critic of literature, whose commentary, you can say, is conditioned by his concern for the imagination. Okay? Third, he shows a strong interest in the folklore and its relation to literature. That is, which is anticipated in Samuel Taylor Coleridge and William Wordsworth. Next is that he often emphasizes patriotic and political themes that promote the ideas of freedom, liberty, justice, and all special concerns of the early romantic writers. Finally, Collins continually expresses concern for psychological issues in his poetry, and all these themes are tied directly to the problem of imagination. Now, the next poet which we are going to talk of is William Cowper. He was from 1731 to 1800. He was an immediate forerunner of the Romantics. He was an English poet and also known as hymnodist. What is a hymnodist? A person who writes and studies hymns. So, in many ways, Coleridge called him the best modern poet. His religious sentiment and association with John Newton, who wrote the hymn Amazing Grace, led to much of the poetry for which he is best remembered. The first volume of his poems contains the progress of error, truth, table talk. Okay, but he is popularly known for the task, and it is one of the longest and finest poem. The complete title is The Task, a poem in 6 books. It is written in blank verse and was published in 1785. The 6 books which he describes here is The Sofa, The Timepiece, The Garden, The Winter Evening, The Winter Morning Walk, and The Winter Walk at Noon. And what he does is he mocks Miltonic passages. Miltonic passages were very much, you can say, having so much of uh, indictment, and there was so much of phrases, there was so much of study done. But what Cooper has done is that he has mocked that passage, and he has described about the meditations on the blessings of nature, and also the retired life, the religious faith. And he also has attacked on slavery, blood sports, fashionable frivolity, lukewarm clergy, and the French despotism among that. Cooper's subjects are those that occur to him naturally in the course of his reflections. Cooper was, you can say, he was a pioneer who preached the gospel, that is, return to nature. He foreshadowed Wordsworth and Byron, and in his love of nature, his emotional response to it was the sympathetic handling of rural life, that is, anticipating Wordsworth. The next poem we are going to talk about, poet we are going to talk about is George Crabbe. He was a pioneer of naturalistic reaction against the Augustan tradition. His main poetical works are written in the heroic couplet, but thematically they deal with the life of simple country folk and show his sincerity, sympathy, and acute observation of the human life. So George Crabbe is because of this known for this only. And the minute observation is, you can say, a special quality of the romantics. And this was started from the transitional poets only. His place is certainly very high. Whose place? George Crabbe's place. The next poet are, you can say, Bishop Percy, Christopher Smart. They were the minor poets, but still they had written something which has given or which has made a pathway for the romantic. Percy's it has revived the romance of the Middle Ages, and he also revived the ballad, which was deftly used by Coleridge and Keats. Now, they were the transitional poets, and one thing we have seen very common in them, that most of them have written in heroic couplets only, but the content which they are talking about is nature, human being, their problems, how they deal with it, okay, the rustic life, understood? But two, three poets were there who were the precursors of Romanticism. And the two important names were Robert Burns and William Blades. You can say that they have founded the new school of poetry known as Romanticism. They were just before Wordsworth and Coleridge became popular. So Robert Burns, he was influenced by the tradition of Scottish poetry, and uh, the life he has seen there. He is also known as the national bard or bard of Ayrshire and the ploughman poet, because he most of the time he writes in epithets, and he describes Scotland only. That is why he is also considered as a national poet of Scotland. Though he is celebrated worldwide, but he is considered as the national poet of Scotland. Now, he is regarded as the, you can say, the precursor of romantic movement, because he has founded the ideas of liberalism and socialism. Not exactly founded, but you can say he has, through his writings, he has developed the ideas of liberalism and socialism. And the most important poems which he has written is The Quarter Saturday Night. It was first published in 1786. The poem is dedicated to Robert Aiken, a successful Ayrshire lawyer who was Burns' patron at that time. And the opening stanza addresses him in advancing the poet's the poem's sentimental theme. And the lines are, what Aiken in a cottage would have been, ah, though his worth unknown, for happier there I win. So it is all about on a cold Saturday night evening in November, a Scottish cotter, a peasant farmer, you can say, who labors in return for the right to live in a cottage, returns home to his family ahead of Sabbath. His wife and numerous children gather around the fire to share their news, while he gives out fatherly advice and admonition based on Christian teachings. So, this is the poem all about. The next significant poem which Burns has written is Tam O'Shanter. It is a wonderful epic poem where Burns paints a vivid picture of drinking class of the old Scotch town of Ayr. Means at that time the drinking class was there also, and here in Tam O'Shanter he talks of that class only. The poem includes a tale which is full of humor, pathos, horror, social comment, and you can say much of the beautiful lines which Burns could paint during that time. For example, we can quote one, but pleasures are like poppies spread. You seize the flower, its bloom is shed, or like the snow falls in the river, a moment white, then melts forever. So how beautifully he has expressed here. So Burn is known for Robert Burns is actually known for speaking straight from the heart to the primitive emotions of the race. His poetry shows great interest in the lives of poor peasants of Scotland, and he depicts all the things with sincerity, compassion, and natural feelings, the joys and sorrows of the people around him. And you can say he brilliantly blends man and nature. The next poet, which is very important before the Romantics, is William Blake. He is popularly known as, I mean, being a student of literature, you might be also knowing that Songs of Innocence and Songs of Experience is known for it. Now, his first publication is Poetical Sketches, and it is a series of imitative poems. He has experimented with various verse forms, which was used by Spenser, Shakespeare, and Milton. And he became very popular with his Songs of Innocence and Songs of Experience. In both the collection, it is short lyrics expressing the poet's view of the original state of human society, symbolized in joy and happiness of children. Whereas in the Songs of Experience, there is the mood of spontaneous love and happiness, but is replaced by the less joyful note, as we have seen in Songs of Innocence, because he is having a deep sympathy for the child and he describes it in a joyful mood. In Songs of Experience, the joy is a bit less, and it's very natural to ourselves also. When we are growing as a child, we enjoy more, but when we become grown up, then the enjoyment does not last long. It is only for a moment. So now his other books are the books of Thale, the French Revolution, the Visions of the Daughters of Albion, and the first book of Brazen. Blake was a lyric poet par excellence. As a lyricist, apart from being a lyricist, he was also a visionary, like Shelley was there. And he has told many things about nature, love, and liberty. So we have seen that the transitional poets, though, they are not very much popular as the romantics, but they have given a way to the romantics. And though they have written in heroic couplets, they are concerned with each and every problem of human being and the nature in which we are living. They are not only concerned with the intellectuality, because a human being is made of two things: intellect and emotion. And intellect was talked much about in the neoclassical, but emotion was given importance by the transitional poets and later on by the romantics. I would like to quote the preface to Winter by James Thompson, where he has expressed his view of his subject. And he says, I know of no subject more elevating, more amusing, more ready to awake the potential enthusiasm, the philosophical reflection, and the moral sentiment than the works of nature. Where can we meet with such variety, such beauty, such magnificence? All that enlarges and transports the soul. What more inspiring than a calm, a wide survey of them? For this reason, the best, both ancient and modern, poets have been passionately fond of retirement and solitude. The wild romantic country was their delight, and they seem never to have been more happy than when, lost in unfrequented fields, far from the little busy world, they were at leisure to meditate and sing the works of nature. The preface of this work, that is the work of Winter, in Winter he has written seasons, as I have described earlier, and in this, before writing Winter, he has given a preface to it. There, you can very well see that he has described all that are the forms of romanticism and the transitional, all the points he has discussed, which is much related to romanticism and the romantic poetry, along with the philosophy, the morality is there, the philosophical reflection is there, sentiment is there, nature is